Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, today's video explores one of the darkest legacies of World War I, the First World War. The shattered faces of soldiers, airmen and sailors who were torn apart by machine gun bullets, shell fire, high explosives. Many of them survived the battlefields, but to return home so disfigured that they were unrecognizable even by their own families. Out of this tragedy arose a new kind of medicine. It was pioneered by surgeons, artists and sculptors, all working together to rebuild faces, restore dignity to broken men, giving them a chance to live again. From Harold Gillies with his revolutionary skin grafts to the haunting mask sculpted in Paris. This is the story of how World War I gave birth to modern plastic surgery. You know, when it comes to being disfigured, I know what I'm talking about. That's why I've got a moustache. It covers up the disfigurement I have on my upper lip, and also why I have a fringe. And, of course, my hands with a vitiligo. So, I really do feel for these guys. Mine is minor. It's nothing compared to the haunting reality that thousands upon thousands of soldiers on all sides in the First World War survived those devastating facial injuries. They were known as the men with the broken faces. En français, le gueule cassée. I hope I pronounced that right. I mean, how do you rebuild a face when medicine has never dealt with such incredible injuries on such a large scale before? Now, we're going to use some photographs of some of the men who went through the terrible procedures. Now, we're doing this because it's the only way we can tell the story. We're showing them to honor the men who lived through these terrible wounds, and also to honor the doctors who helped rebuild the lives of these most unfortunate men. Now, facial injuries and reconstructive surgery, they're not confined to the First World War, World War I. Men have been suffering terrible facial wounds and injuries throughout history. You go back to the Napoleonic Wars, there were primitive techniques in trying to do skin grafts. I would imagine that was on officers only, because I have read that in the French army, if you had a terrible smashed in face, they simply put a bullet through your brain, finish you off. But it was later on during the 19th century that there were great strides made by dentists with the development of dentures, false teeth, and there was the early maxillofacial work, surgery on the jaw and the mouth. So this is absolutely brilliant. But it was during the American Civil War that we have a surgeon, Gurdon Buck, who rebuilt a guy's mouth. He'd been hit here, from what I can tell, and he put in a hard rubber pallet and then packed out part of the cheekbone with his hard rubber, and then did skin grafts over it, allowing the man to speak and to eat and return home to a civilian life. But we only know of 40 such operations during that terrible American Civil War. Can you imagine the thousands of guys, those disfigured men, who returned home? I know of one who returned, I think it was New York, and he basically had this part of his face missing. So the surgeons had repaired the wound, but this was open. So mucus and spit just drooled out. Apparently the guy managed to get a job as a night watchman, so he's not seen, but he didn't live very long. Apparently infection finally got him. So while we recognize that reconstructive surgery wasn't entirely new, World War I forced innovation in surgery on an unprecedented scale. So with the First World War, there was such an advancement of weapons, these new inventions. There were so many ways you could be killed or maimed. You could be gassed. You could be burnt with a flamethrower, which to me is awful. Poor old sailors at sea, burnt with cordite. Shrapnel shells. Let me show you a piece of shrapnel. Now, this is a shrapnel ball. So with the First World War, you had the trench warfare. So better way to get the soldiers and have shells explode above them and rain down thousands of these ball bearings. But a piece of shrapnel I've got here. Now, I picked this up near Hawthorne Ridge on the Somme many, many years ago. It's just this piece here. This is the nose of a British, we think 18-pounder shell. But this is a solid lump of brass. If that hits you, 200 miles an hour, it'll take your head off. Or if it hits you in the side of the head, it'll take that out. Or from the side, bosh. There's no way that you can prevent it, really. Well, what they did try was helmets. But before I go on to the helmets, just a simple bullet wound. A simple bullet wound, eh? This is the British 303 cartridge. In the First World War, it couldn't be dum-dummed or soft-nosed because that was against the Hague Convention. But this 303 bullet, the same as many others, it can go in, make a nice neat little hole, but inside the body, it will either expand or tumble. And when it comes out, it'll punch a big hole. So you could be hit, say here, just behind the ear. The bullet could come out about there, but instead of it making a nice little hole, it could blow off your lower jaw. This is the horrendous thing. Just these things are flying around the battlefield all of the time. So they dig their trenches, they get down. Now, 1914, 1915, this is your hat. This is your British Tommy's trench cap. Have a look at the poilu, the poor old French soldier's kepi. It's a cloth cap. That's all it is. So you have that. The Germans were slightly better. They had the Pickelhelm, the spiky hat. But this is only hard leather, but it's a little bit better than the cloth cap. They very quickly realised they got to form some other kind of defence. The French, I believe, were the first. They just had a skull cap, but it was not very good and used to drive pieces of metal inside the soldiers. So they come up with the Adrien, which is stylish, quite nice. This one survived the war. The German one, fabulous. Der Stahlhelm. Look at that. That gives you lots of protection, doesn't it? I like this. And the British, of course, no style. And we went for what's called the Brodie helmet, or the battle bowler, or the trench helmet, which is great for stuff coming down. But with all of these helmets, you notice there's that one little bit of you which is exposed, your face. So you imagine then, you catch a wound. You're in hospital. It may have taken days upon days for you to be recovered. It might be actually weeks before you get to a specialist hospital way back in England. Can you imagine not just the physical effect, the pain that these guys went through? Some of them 40 operations to rebuild their face. It's the psychological effects. A very sad tale. Patient X. They completely keep him anonymous. He was fully bandaged up. His facial injuries were pretty bad. And his mother's coming to visit him. And he wanted the bandages taken off. And there was a nurse Black. I think it was the Cambridge Military Hospital in Aldershot. And she recalls that he wanted the bandages off before his mother came. Now, these wards had no mirrors, understandably, eh? But she helped him unbandage his face, you know. She said, I didn't show any sympathy because it only adds to the depression, because this particular soldier, X, had a shaving mirror they didn't know about. And the very first thing he does is he stands up and looks at himself in the mirror. She said, Nurse Black, she could see this soldier just collapse spiritually. And then his mother turned up. Can you imagine that? Seeing your mother, her facial expression didn't change, bless her, but the colour completely drained out of her. Now, they did what surgery they could for patient X, soldier X, but they couldn't completely restore his face. He was so badly injured. He lived the rest of his life as a recluse, hiding away from the gaze of others. So you had a lot of surgeons, doctors and dentists during the First World War who contributed towards this new art of plastic surgery, rebuilding the faces of these poor soldiers, these broken faces. The Germans had their own, quite a brash character apparently, Jacques Joseph. And then you have the Frenchman, Hippolyte Marastin, who was a pioneer in early skin grafts. And then the American, Varastat Kazanyan, these are great names, aren't they, who was an oral surgeon. And the Dutchman, Johannes Esser. Each of these brought different skills to the operating table. But the most interesting one for me has to be Charles Auguste Valadier. He was a Franco-American, French-American. He was a dentist turned surgeon. Now, you either like him, you love him, or you hate him. Because I've been reading about him. Some people say, well, he wasn't qualified, blah, 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 blah. And other people's going, oh, he was such a guy. Well, we owe him a debt of gratitude. Because 1914, October, during the battle for the Aisne, a certain general, Douglas Haig, he had a terrible toothache. Terrible. And he called upon a dentist. And it was then discovered that the British Army, God bless them, didn't have any dentists. You see, things had changed. The Army used to have dentists. But once the cartridges had changed, so the British Army didn't have to bite the end off their cartridge, there was no need for dental hygiene. They got rid of the dentists because we now had bullets. And old Haig's going, what's wrong? We don't have any dentists. He probably said it in a Scottish accent, actually. So they turned to Valadier with his private practice in Paris, but they'd heard that he travels to the front line with the French in his Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, where he had a dentist chair fitted in the back. So he was commissioned, come the 70 miles up to General Haig on the Aisne, where he fixed the general's tooth, extracted the rotten tooth. And General Haig was so impressed, he ordered that he should be decorated because this poor chap had to abandon his motor car under shell fire, had done such a good job extracting the tooth. He did, in fact, have a local commission as a lieutenant in the British Army, and he becomes one of the first dentists the Army has during the First World War. And it's interesting because come the end of 1914, there were 20 dentists in the British Army, and come the end of the war, there were well over 800 dentists. And then in the 1920s, we had the Army Dental Corps formed, and I know all about them because they fixed all my teeth when I broke them. Thanks, guys. Valadier's arrival on the scene coincided in 1914 with the First Battle of Ypres. He was assigned to number 13 Stationary Hospital. But you imagine this battle, thousands of wounded are pouring into these hospitals. And Valadier, quickly realised that there was more work to be done than just tooth decay. Do you know at that time, 28% of the wounded were dying from infection? It was in fact an Australian doctor, he called it a war of fecal infection. If a surgeon, now you've got to understand these thousands of wounded are pouring in. You got half your face torn apart. He'll wash it, clean it, then he'll stitch it up. When he stitched it up, that was a bit of a death sentence because inside here, you have your oral bacteria and everything. Now, Valadier very quickly realised he got to do something with this infection, so he had what he called his fire engine. And it's a drum of water. The water has been boiled, so it's nice and clean. There's a rubber tube on the end of it. Don't forget there was no plastic in those days. And a bicycle pump on the other side. So you could pump this up, put it under pressure, and then you release the cap and you can flush the wound out with that boiled water and cleaning the wound perfectly. It was not long after arriving at the base hospital number 13 that Valadier was allowed to establish a specialist jaw unit nearby. Now, these soldiers with these smashed-in faces is just what they needed, but Valadier paid for most of the medical equipment himself. He's quite a guy. As I say, you either love him or you hate him because he didn't claim wages from the British Army, not until the last month of the war, October 1918, where he accepted the pay of an infantry major. Now, it was whilst he was there at this specialist unit that he met Harold Gillies, the New Zealander who was in the British Army as a general surgeon. This is where Gillies met the dentist. So Harold Gillies, who some regard as the father of modern plastic surgery, well, Gillies was actually a specialist ENT, ear, nose and throat surgeon. And he was sent to number 13 base hospital to supervise Valadier, the dentist, because Dentists at that time were not allowed to perform surgery unsupervised. Now, Gillies really did learn a lot from Valandier, and they became firm friends. In fact, they corresponded throughout the war, and if I remember correctly, remained friends for the rest of their lives. Now, it was May 1915 that Gillies was posted to the Belgium base hospital, just in time for the Second Battle of Ypres. This was his baptism of fire. It was also the first battle where the Germans used chlorine gas. June 1915, Gillies was now a major, and he was reassigned to the base hospital at Etaples in France. He was granted leave, went home, visited his wife. I think she just had another baby. He played some golf. He was a cracking golfer, but he spent a lot of his time researching other surgeons' work with regards to surgery of the jaw. On his return to France, he was able to visit in Paris Hippolyte Marastin and observe this really fine surgeon as he removed a cancerous growth from the face of a patient and closed the resulting wound using a flap of skin from the patient's neck. He made a note, Gillies, that this probably would have failed in the long run, but he called this his turning point in his career. He was so blown away by this surgery. But on his return to Etaples, Gillies meets Varastad Kazanyan, the Armenian-American dental surgeon who'd recently opened a specialist unit for dealing with facial and dental injuries. It was this time that Gillies realized that all these surgeons working away to deal with these terrible wounds were actually fragmented. They were all over the place. And it was at the end of 1915 that Gillies was authorized to establish his own specialist unit for repair of wounds to the jaw and face at the Cambridge Military Hospital in Aldershot in England, bringing all of the necessary medical disciplines into one place. So if you're repairing a jaw as a surgeon, you've got the dentist who can actually be repairing the teeth, bringing them all together into that one place. So Harold Gillies' experiment of getting all of the doctors and surgeons together in one place at the Cambridge Military Hospital is a major success. In no time at all, there are so many patients flooding in. Each time there's an offensive, more and more badly disfigured servicemen are brought into the hospital. So he gets permission to open up a purpose hospital, not just a ward in a general hospital, an actual purpose-built hospital, if you like. So he takes over a building down in Sidcup in Kent. The Queen is behind him there, so there's royal patronage. It's called the Queen's Hospital. Lots of subscriptions, and so they do open up the Queen's Hospital in Sidcup. And there he develops another system, which is great. If you're wounded badly in the face and you've got to have surgery time and time again, in between each surgery, you've got to have time to heal, and that takes up bed space. So he comes up with the idea of convalescent beds in other hospitals, other places. So you have your surgery, you're allowed to heal so much, then you go off to convalescence. And this was brilliant because some of the cases that he took care of in Sidcup were incredible. The one I'm going to talk about now just absolutely blew my mind, especially when I saw the photographs. Able seaman William Vicarage suffered severe cordite burns to his face, hands and neck at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Now, over a year later, William finds himself in the care of Harold Gillies in Sidcup. The scar tissue, though, think about that, over a year later, the scar tissue was so bad on his face and hands, his eyelids had turned inside out and his lips had rolled down, and his fingers were contorted claw-like. Now, Harold Gillies, he reckons this was the worst burns case he'd ever seen, but that young sailor, William, had showed so much courage that Harold decided he would go ahead with surgery because he believed that that young sailor would actually be able to take the pain. And what Harold Gillies does next is nothing more than incredible. To repair the damage to poor old able seaman Vicarage's face, Harold Gillies used a procedure. He'd used this many times before, but it was very painful and complicated. First of all, he got to cut a V-shaped piece of skin off the chest of the patient. Got to keep it connected. He then stitches it to the lower part of William's face. But part of the skin is still raw, and that's open to infection, so he has to be very careful. But then he also raises 2 thinner strips from William's shoulder to the cheek. And he notices as he does this, they begin to curl inwards. And he just kind of has a bit of a brainstorm there. He stitches them together and they form like a tube, which has got full blood supply, won't get infected. And when it heals to the cheek and there's a good sound blood supply there, they can cut it from the shoulder and then they can open it up, spread the skin, and then stitch it to the damaged tissue underneath. This was called the tubed pedicle, and it was a major breakthrough. Now, once that healthy tissue is there and all the blood's flowing, it's not long before this procedure spreads throughout the hospital, and there are soldiers who've been injured, have got pedicles on their foreheads, the side of their heads, their chins, all that kind of thing. In fact, there's a little side story that long after the war had finished, in fact, nearly a year after the war had finished, a soldier who'd been treated with a pedicle came back to the hospital. It was off the end of his nose, and he still had the pedicle. And when it was, what's been going on? How come you've still got that? There was a major offensive, the 100-day offensive, I think it was, and the hospital got overcrowded. He was in convalescence, and somebody simply says, "Go home, we'll give you a shout when we're ready to finish the operation." And the call never came, and he just wandered in. So they finished that. Now, this story of the tubular pedicle, it's just one major part. But this poor sailor had not had a decent night's sleep since he'd been wounded at the Battle of Jutland over a year before. Don't forget, his eyelids had been burnt and scarred so bad they turned inside out. So Harold Gillies decides he's going to graft him a new pair of eyelids, which actually work. So for the first time in over a year, William Vicarage could lie his head down and actually have a good night's sleep. Now, I've already mentioned about the damage that can be done to the skull with the shells and the bullets. And what I thought I'd do is I'd actually show you a model that I've made. Actually, I've repurposed a model. Kev is recycling. But seriously, Harold Gillies, he had to rebuild from the bone that was smashed or the bone that was completely missing. And to show you how terrible some of those wounds were, I've got this old skull of mine. So here he is. That's pretty much a skull. Let me show you. Let me show you the complete skull. Right, there we go. We're all familiar with this. No problems at all. Hello. But get your head around this. Now, I've actually seen a soldier with a very similar wound, so bear with me if I stutter a little bit. One guy actually lost his entire lower jaw. It's gone. If he's in a trench and he's lying at the bottom of the trench, his friends are going to see him. They're going to, oh my God, if he's awake, he can see them talking about him. If they put him then on the stretcher, face up, he can't swallow. Yeah, his tongue is in rags. He's going to choke to death. And many of them did, apparently. But how about this? I was reading about this other soldier who the bullet had hit him downwards and had taken out an eye, the top part of the jaw, and the lower part of the jaw. So all that's left is a gaping great hole. And these men, some of them survived for days out in no man's land. I was reading one case, a guy was actually in a shell hole full of water, and he was terrified because the water was filling up. It was at Passchendaele. That's, it really does, when you find some of the personal stories. So you got this guy, he's wounded out there, and he knows that the heavy rain of Passchendaele is filling up the shell holes, and he can hear the wounded crying out in these shell holes. But come morning time, he was silent because they'd all drowned. Now, he's found, they get him back, his face is just an absolute mush. And days later, he finds himself under the knife of Harold Gillies, who is going to evaluate and rebuild it. Just 40 to 50 operations some of these guys had to go through. And then at the end of it, if there is that much missing, the surgery might be able to heal some, but it perhaps cannot rebuild, like the cheekbone or something. Perhaps it's completely gone, like this poor chap or the model I've recreated. So then you will have surgery to heal it, rebuild it as best they can. And then you have the masks, these famous masks. Now, I've made a model of one of these, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't enjoy it. It was a model which, it really got to me. Here he is. I copied it, or the idea of it, from a famous picture. Now, if you look at it that way, it is literally all nice and flesh, but on the inside, it's actually metal. Because the way they used to make these, first of all, was out of rubber, and they were quite heavy, 2 or 3 pounds in weight. And then they would make them in very, very thin metal, which could then go over the injury and, emulate the other side of his face. And of course, you've got the glass eye for the eye that's missing. And it's incredible, isn't it? Because I was reading about one French soldier who'd been so badly maimed, he'd not been home for a year. He'd been out of the army for a year, and he'd not been home because he didn't want his mother to see his face. This is over 100 years ago. My heart went out. It really did. But he finds his way to Paris, and he finds himself the lady who would make him a mask. So I'll just show you this again. And then we'll get on. We'll talk about the mask makers. So the famous British mask maker was in fact a famous sculptor of the day, Francis Derwent Wood. At the beginning, his masks were made of rubber. As I said, they were too heavy, so they then went on to make them out of this very light metal. They were very fragile, but they gave the wearer a social face. Now, Anna Coleman Ladd, she was the famous American lady who set up under the auspices of the American Red Cross in Paris. She had the studio of portraits and masks, and she tells you how she'd come in on a Tuesday, lunchtime, and there'd be normally 7 soldiers waiting, and she would be fitting them ready for their various masks, and how they become a community, because she never treated them differently. And that's the key, isn't it? Didn't treat them any differently. And even at Christmas time, they would all congregate back there, and they put presents for each other under the tree. To me, this is just wonderful. These masks, they made a difference, and they were indeed works of art. There's not many, there's only a handful, if that, in existence to this day, because they were so very delicate. And also, they could be upgraded, I found out. So if the soldier's injury, as he's having more surgery, packs out, they could change the mask or alter it. Some of them had mouths that could open, others that you could put cigarettes in, but they had to have drains on the inside. And I've just put a couple of little holes here so that they could drain, because you imagine wearing this and you haven't got a nose. All the mucus has got to go somewhere. So the masks, aesthetic, make you look normal. They didn't make you look better. It was just to make you look normal. Also functional, but there were drawbacks. Some people didn't like the fact that they had staring eyes. In fact, there's one mask that I have seen a photograph of a British soldier who lost that much. How do you replace that? How do you replace that? So they did their best. He's totally blind, bless him, and they made him a mask. Because of the staring eyes problem for other people, his mask was fitted on with sunglasses. So these guys, what they went through is unbelievable. Obviously, it went through to the Second World War and to the modern age. As I say, when I was a soldier, I come across the most awful injuries, and it still gets to me, if you want the truth. So I've chosen 3 case studies out of many that Harold Gillies actually performed. And the first one, it's Big Bob Seymour, Private Seymour. I think it was Queen Victoria's Rifles, not quite sure. And his story is quite something. It's the first day of the Somme. He's 7:30 on the, 1st of July 1916, that infamous day. And the whistles blow and up he goes. And he reckons that all these guys are just lying down, as if they've been ordered to lie down. Well, there is an account from a German machine gunner from the opposite side. And he says, we didn't aim. There were that many British soldiers coming towards us. We just fired into them and just kept reloading and continuously firing into them. And of course, the German artillery had been waiting for the British. Wow, terrible, terrible. And Bob Seymour, Big Bob Seymour as he was known, is right in the thick of this. He has to take cover. All around him are dead or wounded. And as he takes cover, he sees a German officer, proud of the German parapet of their trench, directing the machine guns. So he breaks cover and shoots the German officer. Just as he does that, there's an explosion, and a piece of shrapnel from the shell rips off his nose. As he spins around, the machine gun goes through him. 5 rounds, 5 bullets through his back. He's down. Now there is chaos on the Somme front. There are so many wounded coming in. Been a major planning error. They hadn't planned enough hospital trains. They believed that the Somme offensive would be perfect. They should have listened to their intelligence officers. Anyway, that's just my opinion. Eventually, Big Bob is rescued from no man's land. And of course, this is secondary. The fact his nose is gone, or half his nose is gone. What they need to do is get the bullets out of his back. So he's down at a base hospital, has time to heal, and eventually he ends up at the Cambridge Military Hospital in Aldershot, and he's under the knife of Harold Gillies. But Harold had not treated or rebuilt that many noses up until now. His main wounds had been to the jaw, the cheeks, and the mouth. Now he's got just a simple nose, and brilliant. He shows Big Bob photographs of noses and says, what would you like? And he chooses a nice big Grecian nose. And what Harold Gillies had got to do, he'd got to get cartilage across the top to rebuild the bridge of the nose. Got to do that, transfer that, build it, and get blood supply into it. And then a flap of skin down. The first attempt wasn't that good. He looked like he'd got a great big swollen boxer's nose. But the second operation was perfect. So much so that Big Bob became Harold Gillies' private secretary for the next 35 years. And that is quite something when you think the bond that must have been made by then. So Big Bob had a new nose, and it very much a nose you'll see in one of the photographs. That's one of the success stories, because for each success story, there are those that failed. Now, down at Boot Hill in Aldershot, so what we called it, the Boot Hill, is the military cemetery. And there's a large section of it of First World War. And those First World War graves are from the Cambridge military, from the guys who didn't survive. So the second of our case studies is once again a casualty for the first day of the Battle of the Somme. It's Private Walter Ashworth of the 18th West Yorkshire Regiment. He had been going over the top. In fact, if I remember correctly, his regiment didn't get over the top. They were way back when they were hit. But he got a bullet through his cheek, which went through and blew out part of his jaw. Basically, he's left with a massive hole in the front of his face. He collapsed into a shell hole that was half filled with water, and he lay there for 3 days. So the Battle of the Somme, 1st of July. So 2nd and 3rd, he's recovered. And because of his injury, they ship him straight away to the Cambridge Military Hospital, and he arrives there on the 5th of July. That is fantastic when you think of the chaos. But when they look at his wound, it's so bad. Now, they had an artist there, Henry Tonks, who was quite a famous artist. He worked in pastels, and he caught the scene, captured the scene when poor Walter is having the wound flushed out, and he's bent over a kidney dish as the nurse is flushing out the blood and such. The way it's described is that Walter's piercing blue eyes are looking off into the distance. His hair is hanging down as the nurse flushed out the wound. And Henry Tonks captured the scene quite fantastically. But I'll mention Henry a little bit later on. Now, Harold Gillies has got a heck of a job because this poor soldier's got a massive hole in the side of his face. So they've got to realign the jaw for one thing. Now, if your jaw's dislocated, they can put a dental plate on the inside. Click, realign it, keep it in place as it sets. But there's this gaping great bit missing. So they do an external brace that has to fix the jaw in place. Now, each time they did a graft of bone or cartilage, it could take from 3 months to a year for it to heal. And all of that time, the poor patient, Walter, has got to live on a liquid diet. So you imagine the agony these guys are in, the discomfort, and the knowledge that they know that half their face has gone. So Walter's fiancée is informed that Walter is disfigured, and she breaks off her engagement. And poor old Walter now is obviously devastated. But as his wound heals, he's left almost with a kind of a comical expression. It's a half smile, but it's healing quite well. And his fiancée's or ex-fiancée's friend, Louise Grime, she felt terrible the way Walter had been ditched. So she starts to write to Walter and eventually plucks up the courage to have a visit all the way down from Bradford in Yorkshire down to the Cambridge Military Hospital in Aldershot. And there she meets Walter, and friendship, then love blossoms. When he's discharged, he returns to Bradford. He goes back to his old job as a tailor. But his boss didn't like the fact that he had this scar. Now, it must have been pretty raw still, just after the war. So he put him in the back of the shop doing menial tasks. And Walter didn't like this. So he left that position. He marries Louise, which I think is quite wonderful. And they emigrate to Australia, where years after the war, he meets up with Harold Gillies, who's on a tour in Australia. And Harold offers to just alter this little bit of scar tissue here. But Walter declines and simply says, no, thanks, I'm quite fine. He'd accepted his scar tissue. He had found a new life. And indeed, down in Australia, he did well. Now, a final study is Sergeant Sidney Beldam. He was wounded on the 3rd Ypres battle at what's commonly known as Passchendaele. The hell of the rain, it was November, so the whole battlefield was a quagmire. And he's charging forward and a large piece of shrapnel hit him on the right side of his face, I believe, tore through his cheekbone and took out most of his nose. He fell forward, which probably saved his life. If he'd have fallen backwards unconscious, he would have choked, but he fell forward into the mud. And he stayed there for 3 days. It wasn't until the reserve troops coming up were checking for the corpses, the corpse collectors, if you like, that they found him, kicked the body to see if there were any rats in it, because Sidney actually recounted how he felt the rats crawling all over him. And as the corpse collectors kick him, he groans and they, oh my God, this guy's alive. Can you imagine the surprise in all that filth and horror? So he was quickly got down the line, but they eventually sent him, instead of to have his face fixed down with Harold Gillies, he ends up in Lancashire at a hospital, and they believed he's not going to survive. 6 months at the top, so they simply cleaned the wound and stitched it up. Now, as luck would have it, a few months later, he's transferred down to the Queen's Hospital in Sidcup, where Gillies explains to him he's going to have to open up the wound and get rid of all the scar tissue. So he's under the knife. This will be the first of 40 operations to rebuild his face. And I'll tell you now, and you'll see by some of the photographs, rebuild his face he did, because Sidney Beldam was a good-looking bloke. And interestingly, while he's convalescing, there was a local pianist, and she, I think her name was Winifred, she volunteered her service to come and entertain the troops. And as she was coming in with her music under her arm, all prim and proper, she walked past Sidney, and their eyes met. And it was love at first sight. So it's wonderful, some of these stories, but as in Cambridge Military Hospital nearby the cemetery, Queen's Hospital had its own section too. And if ever you're down at Sidcup and you look at the local cemetery, there is a First World War section. And these are the guys who didn't make it. So it's good to pick out the good stories and tell the happy endings, but must remember the sad side to this. So earlier on I mentioned that Henry Tonks, Professor Henry Tonks, the great artist of the day, was painting the wounds of Private Ashworth when they were being drained out. And I wondered, well, why have you got an artist doing it? Because they had photography. Well, of course, when I read on further and did some research, photographs are great, but of course photography in those days, still in its infancy, I suppose, but it was black and white. And what they needed was the detail and the colour inside the wound. So Henry Tonks, his work, Professor Henry Tonks, this great artist, his work was valuable. And there's an interesting point. After the war, during the Second World War, the Blitz hit the archives and much of Harold Gillies' work was destroyed. However, the paintings of Henry Tonks survived, so not everything was destroyed. Now, Henry Tonks was asked to go across to France, to the battlefields, mid-1918, to record the scenes of dressing stations. And he was accompanied by the American expat John Singer Sargent, considered to be one of the finest portrait artists of his generation. Quite wonderful. And these two guys go across to France. Now, Henry Tonks had already been over there, and I do know one of his students had been killed not long before he went back to France. So he was really feeling the whole business of the war. People were sick of it. People were tired. But one of the dressing stations they went to, there'd been a serious gas attack at the battle just before it. And there was line after line of blinded British soldiers who'd been blinded by the gas. And they got their hands on each other's shoulders. And this inspired John Singer Sargent to paint his great work, Gassed. It's an enormous piece of work. It's fantastic. And it now hangs on the walls of the Imperial War Museum in London. So the legacy of Harold Gillies, it's quite something. You know, he wasn't discharged straight after the First World War. He had to stay on dealing with the reconstructive surgery of those poor wounded soldiers. But eventually he returns to civilian practice, but he also trains other surgeons in the reconstructive surgery and the art of cosmetic surgery. But then come the outbreak of war, the Second World War, his skills are required. Now, I understand one of his students, Archibald McIndoe, was his cousin, and it was Archibald who founded the Guinea Pig Club. That was the nickname for the hospital where burned pilots and aircrew were taken to have their reconstructive surgery. It wasn't just aircrew, by the way, it was tank crews as well. But after the Second World War, Gillies continues in private practice with cosmetic surgery, and this is amazing because if ever you have undergone reconstructive surgery or you know somebody who's had cosmetic surgery, they owe their success to that pioneering surgeon, that unassuming man, Harold Gillies, who, by the way, was an absolute superb golfer. You know, just to finish the film, I thought I'd tell you about a little incident. You know, one of my heroes of the First World War is Georges Clemenceau, the Premier, the Prime Minister of France. Yes, me, an Englishman, one of my heroes is French. Get over it. He was quite a character, and at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, 28th of June 1919, it was held in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. All the great and good of the world were coming down to sign this declaration, this Treaty of Versailles. But Georges Clemenceau did something which really reaches into the heart of this old soldier. He had a delegation of wounded French soldiers, the delegation of the mutilated, Délégation de Mutiles. And this group of soldiers walked in, their faces blown apart, so badly disfigured. And they were then sat at a desk in the middle of the proceeding. So every one of the dignitaries had to walk past them. But can you imagine these guys? They're sitting there. One of them's got half his face. He's actually gone. You can see by the photograph. It doesn't matter where they look. It's the Hall of Mirrors. It doesn't matter where the dignitaries look. They will see these guys. And Georges Clemenceau was making a point. This is the savagery. This is the cost of war. And it really gets to me because he's one of the few dignitaries that I know would do something like this. And when it was all over and it was signed, Georges Clemenceau walked over to those poor, poor men and he said, "There, this is your reward. Peace." Well, I hope you found that film interesting. It was actually voted for by my Patreon members. It's one of the perks of being a Patreon member of the History Squad. Now, before I depart, I'd like to give a shout out to some of my Patreon members. As ever, I've got it written down. So, a big thank you, guys. Richard Martin, Owen Donahue, and A. Domine. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Hey, guys, thanks a million. Bye for now.